onset and was a common occurrence. It was associated with a short lifespan, but it was also linked to religious acceptance and often very well-developed forms of ritual observance to mark the ending of a life and the departure of a person from this world in a very public way. In traditional societies, the manner of care was often, as we know, very limited. There was little medical or professional involvement in the care of people dying, and the most likely place to die would be at home and within one's own community. But it was a death essentially faced by family and community, and in a traditional context with relatively little professional engagement. In modern societies, the onset of death changes. It becomes more gradual in character, and as we've heard, it becomes more and more associated not with sudden death through epidemic, but rather through chronic illness, at least in the West. And I've been struck by the talks that we've had this morning, which have been very much focused on ways of thinking about death, ways of thinking about illness, ways of thinking about autonomy, which prevail in Western societies. And we need to remind ourselves that some of those aspects of modern death are not prevalent in all cultures and societies of the world. But in the modern context, death is perhaps also associated with religious doubt or even secularism. People are concerned about the process of dying because they may have doubts about the existence or non-existence of a life after death. In the modern world, we became increasingly uncomfortable with the ritualization of death. Death became more private, enclosed behind doors, and often associated with social taboos and a level of personal and public indifference. And of course, in this kind of society, death shifts from the home as the most likely place for its occurrence to the hospital, to the medical institution. And within that context, death comes to be seen as a medical failure. Sociologists have come to talk about the world in which we now live as characterized by the features of postmodernism. And if we think about the postmodern world in relation to death, a slightly different picture begins to emerge. Now, illness becomes unpredictable in its course. There are possibilities of living to very advanced age. I was looking at a remarkable photograph in an English newspaper just last week of people three men who'd been involved in the First World War in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The youngest of the three men was 108 years old, and the oldest was 112. The possibility of advanced age with comorbidity, chronic disease, periods of remission from illness, periods of relative well-being, sometimes perhaps all put together in a rather unpredictable manner, become features of the postmodern death context. And within that context, one of the features has become a turn to personal forms of spirituality. The idea that individuals may face death alone and may have somehow to work out their own spiritual problems, dilemmas, and needs in the face of death. In the postmodern world, there's been something of a resurgence in rituals associated with death, and we've seen many examples of this around the world associated with the death of famous individuals or with major catastrophes, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, accidents in football and sports stadia. Many, many examples of new forms of expression of ritual to mark death, bereavement, and public sorrow, often highly individualized and set free from the shackles and rules that govern death in earlier periods. Some sociologists, therefore, have said that the language of consumerism is the way in which we should now look at death in the postmodern context. And certainly in my own society, in the United Kingdom, the dominant ethos, some would say almost a mantra, repeated day after day within the healthcare system, is the promotion of choice on the part of patients and service users. And this notion of choice at the end of life has also become a strong feature of the postmodern death context. Well, it's in this postmodern death context in which we now all live that hospice and palliative care has primarily developed. And it's in that context of a changing approach and understanding of death, in a changing epidemiology and demography of death, in the changing character of what it means to be ill, that hospice and palliative care have emerged. And there's no doubt that the world of palliative care is a challenging environment. I was very interested in this article by one of our great leaders in the field, Professor Eduardo Bruera, who published a piece just earlier this year remarking on why it is that young faculty members, academic researchers and clinicians, nurses, physicians, social workers and others might want to get involved in palliative care in a field of work that seems so uncertain in its status, which offers relatively little job stability, and certainly for many wouldn't be seen as a shortcut to fame and fortune. And reading that article, I got interested in thinking a bit more about why it is that we become involved in palliative care. So I wanted to say a little bit about personal motivations and touch on, and indeed to salute, the role of some very important individuals who've shaped the recent and still evolving history of modern hospice and palliative care. And I wanted to think about this in relation to the motivations of those people. And my dear colleague Michael Wright, who I've worked with very closely over the last decade, is a man who loves to come up with diagrams and models, and this is his latest model, which is an attempt to define the parameters that motivate people for engagement in the world of palliative care. And you can see how complex it is. And at the center of it, there are three dimensions: professional motivations, personal motivations, and spiritual motivations. And in some work that Michael and I are doing at the moment, we're trying to tease out how these motivations have shaped the history of palliative care and what impact they may have on its future development. Well, that history is a fascinating one, and it's become a global history. It's sad to have to acknowledge today the death of Professor Venter-Friede, pictured here, and pictured to his left as you look at it, Florence Wald from the United States, who also died just a couple of weeks ago, one of the great pioneers of palliative care in North America, who so much was influenced by Cicely Saunders in the United Kingdom, pictured just above them. All around the world, our field is marked by the influence of charismatic, motivated, inspirational individuals who on every continent and against all kinds of problems and difficulties have shaped the modern history of palliative care over the very period that we are talking about today in the context of the history of the Floriani Foundation.